All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our presentation this afternoon. First off, just want to thank you all for taking a little bit of time out of your day to join us this afternoon. And we have a really informative presentation for you that we hope you learn a thing or two by the end of it. And we are extremely excited to have you all. So thanks again for joining us. My name is Dustin Vassar, and I will be your host today, guiding you through the webinar this afternoon. We'll have a few polls throughout the presentation, kind of in between the various topics that we'll discuss, as well as a Q&A session at the end. So we invite you to interact as much as possible, really so you can get the most out of your webinar. And since we have a really large group on the call today, we just ask that you please mute your phones and computer mics so we can avoid any background noise during the presentation. The webinar is being recorded, so if you'd like to watch it again later or maybe share it with somebody, we'll provide you with a link and a follow-up email later. And again, just a few notes before we begin. There's a couple features that you will be able to utilize during the webinar, and the first one is our questions feature. Anytime you got a question during the presentation, please feel free to ask it. There's a questions tab on your screen, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A portion at the end. And the second feature is a poll. So we'll have a few questions throughout the presentation, and certainly encourage you guys to vote and participate so we can really understand who we have on the call here with us today and maybe some of the expectations that you have. All right, and just a little bit of information about Vic and myself. I attended the University of Texas at Arlington, and I'm located here down in Dallas, Texas, and work with a team here in the Southwest region, working with our clients to help them achieve their fisheries goals, whether, that's a trophy fishery or more just of a recreational fishing lake. Really, my job is to understand what your ideal fishery looks like and then work together with Vic and the rest of our team of experts to accomplish those goals. And next, I'd like to introduce our presenter, Vic Vicenzo. We are extremely excited to have Vic on our team, as Vic is definitely one of the most respected in our industry. Vic has an undergraduate degree in fisheries science and earned his Master of Science degree in biology from Tennessee Tech. He served as a district fisheries biologist for more than 20 years before earning his PhD in fisheries conservation. At Solitude, Vic is very instrumental in the design and implementation of the studies that really aid our clients in helping them construct, holistic fisheries management plans. Vic is an expert in all of the services that we offer and regularly conducts electrofishing surveys and has worked with countless number of anglers to help them achieve their goals. Again, very excited to have you all here with us today. We have people here from Texas to Massachusetts, Wyoming down to Florida, and even from the Virgin Islands, where it's a nice, cool 85 degrees, which is much better than the expected high temperature here in Texas today of 107 degrees. But thanks again, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. We certainly have a great mix of professions and backgrounds in the audience, but certainly everybody will gain something out of today's presentation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Vic.
Thank you, Dustin, and good afternoon, everybody. I echo Dustin's welcome to you all and appreciation for giving us some time today. I know those of us here at Solitude have really enjoyed putting this together, and we hope that you find it informative and learn a little bit along the way, and at the end we can have some back and forth discussion. So with that being said, I'll quickly go over the agenda. And I guess as we discuss fisheries management, I kind of like to think that we break it down into three areas. So let's begin with a sort of a classical definition of fisheries management. This will be as technical as we get today, probably. But fisheries management is the manipulation of aquatic organisms, aquatic habitat, and human users to provide sustained benefits to humans and the ecosystems being managed. So within that formal definition are three critical components. And this presentation is structured in such a way to expand on each of these three areas and provide examples of how they all come together to create successful fisheries management. And as Dustin said, we'll conclude the webinar with a question and answer session. So during the webinar, please note areas where you have some additional questions, and hopefully we have time at the end to address them. We'd like to use our time today, not really to provide a lot of technical background on fisheries management, but rather to break it into 3 critical topic areas and then discuss the variety of strategies that can help you achieve your dream fishery. And dream fisheries mean different things to different people. Look at the photos on this slide. A dream fishery could be trophy fish, it could be family recreation, or it could be high catch rates of healthy fish. And not only do people's goals vary, but the types of lakes that people own also vary. So the challenge of the fisheries manager is to clarify what people want, understand what they have, and then create an adaptive management plan that helps them achieve success. And I'll refer to this adaptive management plan a little bit and go into further detail in a few minutes. So for example, do you have a small pond or multiple ponds on the same property? Or I know we have a lot of folks on the call today that have neighborhood communities with larger lakes probably. And those larger lakes may have numerous lake users, all with different values on how the lake should be managed. So I suspect for the people participating in the webinar today that we have people with different goals. So let's take a look using our first poll.
Thanks, Vic. You know, there are many different types of fisheries that we manage, and like Vic said, they all have different goals, different budgets and expectations, and really selecting the right type of fishery for you depends on a few key elements. Is it commercial use pond where higher catch rates are more important than really the size of the fish? Or is it a fishing club with members that expect to catch large trophy bass? Is it a private lake simply used for friends and family? Just to have a good time. You know, really on the surface, all 3 of these types of water bodies look the same, but the options on how you manage them are pretty broad. And again, it's all tied back to your goals and what your expectations are. And since we do have a wide variety of backgrounds here, let's get started with the first poll and see how it's divided up. All right, so it looks like more of a recreational lake takes the win here with 57% family and friends, and following behind that is fishing club at 20%, and then community properties, and then just local private lakes. So pretty divided, which is what I expected and what we see on a day-to-day basis. But next, Vic is really going to talk more about who your stakeholders are. So Vic.
Thanks, Dustin. And most of the fisheries biologists that I know didn't get into this business to work with people, but people are such an important component in fisheries management. So who are the people? The term that we use in fisheries is stakeholders. And the stakeholders is quite simply anyone who is directly affected by management activities, but could also include those that think they'll be affected, as well as those who may not even know they'll be affected. So identifying stakeholders for a small farm pond, for instance, is relatively simple. It's generally the owners of the farm, but it could also include downstream pond owners. So if you've got 2 ponds and one off the property downstream connected by a stream, imagine stocking that upper lake with a species and then heavy rains come by and wash some of those fish downstream. Now those downstream owners are stakeholders of what's going on upstream. As lakes get larger, though, identifying stakeholders becomes a lot more complex. So lakes and subdivisions will be a good example. All homeowners are essentially stakeholders, not just those that fish the lake. There's a lot of other lake users too, swimmers and boaters and wildlife watchers and those that just want to live near the water. And all these groups value the lake in some unique way. So as you can see, the consideration of stakeholder values it's not only critical for successful fisheries management, but it's also quite challenging. So why is it important to understand stakeholders? Why do we spend so much time trying to identify goals and things like that? Because ultimately it's the goals for the lake are your goals, the stakeholders' goals. It's not something that the fisheries biologist sets. It's the job of the fisheries biologist to obtain the goals of the fishery from the stakeholders and then use his or her technical experience to develop a plan that meets those goals. And that's the important distinction that I want everybody to understand. It stakeholders make value choices, but fisheries professionals make the technical choices. So let's take a look at a couple of case studies that provide different examples of fisheries management in action. So this one particular property that we manage has 6 small lakes. The total acreage is about 21 acres. And having this many lakes allows the owner to have multiple goals. For instance, one pond is managed for trophy largemouth bass, and we've done so by improving water quality, enhancing productivity, managing the ratio of prey to predators, providing a diverse forage base. And you can kind of see the results in this graph that improvements in the length of largemouth bass has been achieved over 3 years with a variety of strategies. We manage another pond on this property for high catch rates of largemouth bass and hybrid striped bass. And we did this by stocking feed-trained fish. So these fish, they not only provide high catch rates, but because of the high quality nutrition, the fish are large and healthy. It's a great place for families to fish as well. There's a third pond on the property that we manage for trout because it has incredibly high water quality. And it's really conducive to that sort of management. The remaining 3 ponds are managed for quality largemouth bass and tiger muskie. Now, tiger muskie are more of a northern species, and they're not routinely stocked in small ponds, but it provides the anglers that fish there with the chance of catching a large, charismatic, and unique fish. So in this case, the stakeholders were able to identify a number of different experiences that they wish to create, but each of the 4 goals required very different approaches to fisheries management, and the result was a successful and diverse fisheries management program on this property. Now let's shift gears and look at something a little bit different. Now this lake provides an example of a larger system that has many diverse stakeholders. It's a 350-acre lake in a subdivision that has about 1,000 homes. The lake's about 60 years old, and over time, habitat quality and subsequently the fisheries declined. So anglers weren't happy with the quality of fish they were catching, but interestingly, non-anglers who lived there also wanted to know that the lake that they lived near had a healthy fishery. So with stakeholder goals clearly stated, our approach was to assess the fishery with electrofishing, also evaluate the habitat, and then develop a 5 years management plan that focused on improving habitat for fish in all seasons. So that would be near shore habitat, deep water habitat, as well as balancing the fish population in terms of predator to prey ratio. So one of the ways that we knew initially that there were more predators than the prey could support was by studying fish weights in the lake. Now, the previous slide, we showed an example of fish lengths. This graph here is an example of fish weights. So from 2014 to 2017, we observed more than a 10% increase in the relative weights of largemouth bass. The relative weight is a metric that fisheries biologists across the country use to compare the weight of a fish of a given length and determine how healthy it is. So this is just one example of how the health of the fishery has improved in just 3 years. And on a lake this size, communication has also been important as we routinely communicate with various groups of stakeholders. So there's always transparency in all the work that we do. And 3 years into the plan, we have succeeded in making the fishery healthier and a place where anglers are even noting the differences in the quality of fish they catch. Now, I'd like to switch gears and discuss habitat, the second of the 3 critical areas. And to most people, habitat management is adding structure in the lake that attracts and holds fish and makes them easier to find and easier to catch. But I think what we'll show today is that habitat has a lot more layers and is a lot more complex than simply adding fish cover. So in the next several slides, we'll talk about why habitat is one of the 3 critical areas of fisheries management. So what is fish habitat and why is it important? Well, fish habitat can be defined as basically the healthy surroundings for fish to survive and reproduce. And it's the foundation to a healthy fishery. So properly managed habitat allows fish to thrive and grow in a healthy environment. So I think you can probably start to see why habitat becomes one of those 3 critical areas. So I mentioned that habitat is more than fish cover, and some of the ways that can influence how successful your habitat is by evaluating water quality, algae, aquatic vegetation, nutrients, and of course fish cover. Another good way of thinking about habitat is that it provides limitations to how successful your fishery can be. So is it fertile? Does it have the right algae? Is there the right amount of aquatic vegetation? Because as we'll talk about in a few minutes, you can have too little vegetation and as well too much vegetation. Is the water quality good, or is it prone to fish kills? So these are the types of questions that we would ask when assessing fish habitat. A question that we get a lot often is what is good water quality for fisheries? And that's a pretty complex question. Water quality varies not only from lake to lake, but within a lake from season to season, and can even change within seasons. So, healthy water quality affects all life in and around the water body. Without healthy water quality, your fishery is going to struggle to succeed. And one of the reasons why is that poor water quality can stress fish, and stress in fish often leads to reduced growth rates and higher mortality rates. So when we think about proper water quality management, we're considering parameters such as dissolved oxygen and temperature and pH, and ammonia, alkalinity, nutrients such as phosphorus and nitrogen, and then even visibility. So we'll talk about visibility several times today, and quite simply, it's if you are in your boat in the middle of the lake and you look down into the water, how far can you see into that water? And that's a metric of water quality that we often refer to. So testing these parameters provides an indication of where improvements are needed, and like I mentioned, it can identify limitations to your fishery. So when we begin work on a lake, it's really conducive to have water quality analysis to sort of better understand what we're working with. The stratification is something that many of you all are probably familiar with, but it's the layering of water in a pond or a lake due to temperature differences. It usually becomes an issue in the summertime, when warmer water at the surface and cooler water, more dense water at the bottom. And this density difference between layers prevents the upper and lower water from mixing, and that the dividing line or layer between the upper and lower is called the thermocline. And the thermocline is quite simply an area of water where the temperature changes very quickly. So as a result, you have cooler water in the bottom, cut off from the primary source of oxygen, which would be atmospheric air, and sometimes left without oxygen, or it goes anoxic until the fall when the lake turns back over. And why can this be a problem? Well, for fish such as largemouth bass, their preferred water temperature in the summertime often lacks oxygen. So consequently, they are sort of squeezed into the upper layer of the pond or lake where they have enough oxygen to survive, but their temperature is higher than ideal. So it's not their preferred zone. They're sort of squeezed into there. And stratification and turnover can often lead to fish kills as well. So to get ahead of stratification, you sort of need to be proactive. Aeration systems are really good at bottom diffused aeration. What that would do is sort of break down that thermocline, create an isothermal or the same temperature from top to bottom, but also provide oxygen from top to bottom. You can also plant beneficial aquatic vegetation. And again, these water quality tests that we talked about in the previous slide are critical in the summer, warmer months when things are generally at their worst. And all of these steps can enhance fish production. The base of the food chain is something that we call phytoplankton or microscopic plants. But what governs the abundance of phytoplankton is nutrients. And most nutrients that we're going to talk about is going to be nitrogen and phosphorus. So for the same reason that a farmer must understand how many nutrients are available to their crops and if they need to fertilize, the same can be said for lakes, lake fisheries. But like anything else, too many nutrients can be a bad thing. So what are the negative effects of too much phosphorus? Well, it often leads to abundance of nuisance plants and algae. And it can enter your water body through runoff, through fish feed, or anything else you're adding to the lake. So when you're thinking about nutrients in the lake, you actually have to think beyond the shoreline and think about what's going on in the watershed. Is there a farm upstream that is fertilizing their fields, and after a rain, all those nutrients end up in your lake? So you need to think about it in terms of the watershed as well. And higher concentrations of phosphorus can lead to massive algal blooms, which can lead to dissolved oxygen spikes, loss of fish. So again, that water test that I talked about a couple slides ago is critical for trying to better understand what you have. Now, fisheries managers often take a different perspective on phosphorus. In many lakes across the country, phosphorus is the limiting nutrient. So a lot of the fertilizers that you'll see are high in phosphorus. So it's important to the productivity of the food chain. Dependent on your goals, phosphorus can be either good or bad. If for example, the stakeholder that wants large bass will want higher nutrient levels than someone who wishes to maintain a healthy trout fishery, where they want to keep those nutrients at much lower levels. And one thing that we'll talk about a little bit today is that there's a trend between productivity and fish production, and that productivity again is fueled by nutrients. So it's kind of important to understand your nutrient levels, how they relate to your goals, and how they can be best managed to provide the desired fishery that you're seeking. And there are several ways you can manage your fishery to reach healthy phosphorus levels. Liming your lake, just like farmers lime their fields often, restores pH balance and alkalinity levels. Alkalinity is something that directly affects the availability of nutrients to aquatic organisms. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we discuss fertilizer. So low alkalinity levels reduce productivity and also are responsible for broad swings in pH, which can stress fish and insects. Now, fertilizing is the other way to achieve healthy phosphorus levels. It's a very common lake management practice to improve fisheries. Because it can increase biomass in lakes and ponds greatly. Properly fertilized ponds can sustain 3 to 4 times the biomass of fish that unfertilized ponds can. But clear water is appealing, but often lacks the food chain basics. So while a lake might have 10-foot visibility, it's not going to have a broad base of the food chain to promote fish production. So fertilizing boosts that growth of phytoplankton, which is the microscopic plants, and then zooplankton, which would be microscopic animals. And this provides food source for small fish. But fertilizing is not something that, it's something that you would have to have a conversation with a fisheries biologist about, because if it's done incorrectly, it can be devastating. Fertilizing should be done during the growing season, which is going to vary across the country. And precautions to look out before fertilizing, well, you need to know your alkalinity. It goes back to that water test, because if you have low alkalinity, then you're not going to get the benefits of adding fertilizer. And you're going to want to treat any undesirable vegetation you have before fertilizing, because if you don't, then those nutrients are going to go straight to the species that you don't even want. So you want to have a handle of that. And again, the aeration is something here that can be a benefit. And again, the water test is a simple water test is going to provide a lot of information to better understand the needs of liming and fertilizing in your lake. Now, promoting healthy algae and aquatic vegetation is a key to creating your desired green fishery in your lake. Now, green planktonic and macroalgae, two different things, provide more benefits than problems. And when I say problems, I'm thinking along the lines of blue-green algae or cyanobacteria. Green planktonic algae will turn the color of the pond a greenish color. And that's the phytoplankton that we've been discussing, and it's the base of the food chain. Phytoplankton takes sunlight energy and turns it into chemical energy through photosynthesis. And again, there's the base of your food chain. So you've got an abundant phytoplankton population. You've got the right green planktonic algae. Those are eaten by zooplankton, which supports macroinvertebrates and larval fish. And again, you've got the sort of food pyramid or triangle shape, if you will, that is your food chain. Macroalgae, on the other hand, it appears to be rooted, but there's really no true vascular system or roots. And it provides habitat for zooplankton and other small food organisms to live and reproduce, habitat for macroinvertebrates. It can remove calcium and other nutrients from the water. It can grow quickly and reach the surface, but it's pretty easy to tame through various methods like biological or chemical control. But most of the time it can be left alone as it adds benefit to the fishery. Now, in terms of aquatic vegetation, as I mentioned earlier, it's a key habitat component to a lake's fishery. Vegetation provides habitat for largemouth bass to orient to as they're structure oriented for feeding. It also provides places for bluegill, often the preferred food of largemouth bass. It provides a place for bluegill to hide. Now, there's a sweet spot of the amount of vegetation that you're going to want in your pond, and enough research has been done to show that about 15 to maybe 20% adds enough habitat complexities for a balanced and healthy fishery. Because if you have too little, then you don't have enough places for the bluegill to hide, and they become easy prey to largemouth bass. Conversely, if you have too much vegetation, then you've got too many opportunities for bluegill to hide. It disrupts the feeding behavior of largemouth bass, and you end up with an out of balance population. And another facet that you need to consider with aquatic vegetation is you want to avoid weeds that grow quickly or grow thickly, spread easily, because control methods can get costly. And one plant that comes to mind here would be hydrilla. So we've discussed a variety of habitat topics, and we haven't even gotten into fish cover yet, but let's talk about that now. As I mentioned earlier, the one thing that most people associate with habitat, and that's cover. Cover is one of the most important factors in any fisheries management plan. It acts as a refuge for small fish and then a staging ground for larger, more predator-based fish. And it can affect the success of your predator-prey management plan, just like I mentioned with the vegetation in the previous slide. So the amount of cover should depend on fishery size and depth. And what really helps here in developing a fish cover plan is a bathymetric map, or a map that shows the various contours of the lake. It allows a fisheries manager to try to figure out where the best places to add fish cover would be for different seasons of the lake. So too much cover, that'll spread fish out, make it difficult for predator fish to feed, and also it'll make it difficult for people to catch if they're too spread out. But not enough cover, again, it makes it too easy for predators to prey on the smaller fish. Now, there's two types of cover, essentially, and your choice of cover, it could be based off your budget. Natural cover, things like rocks and trees or old farm equipment or aquatic vegetation, as you see in the picture on the right, they're generally a lot cheaper. It can stretch your dollar since a lot of times you have trees on the property that you can use. And that allows you to basically focus your budget on things that would promote fish growth and not tie up your resources in fish cover. The other type of fish cover would be artificial, and that would be the picture on the left. That's a type of artificial cover. Sort of looks like trees with limbs, and they're good fit for water bodies where floating trees could be a liability to boating. They're long lasting. They're often designed in a way that when an angler brings a bait across there, the hook won't snag on those limbs, and generally a little bit more expensive. So it's going to come down to how can you stretch your dollar the best and provide the most appropriate fish cover for your lake. Now, that concludes the section of the presentation on habitat. But before we discuss some various fisheries management approaches, let's see what species of fish are most interested to the people on the call.
Yeah, thanks, Vic. Really what that leads us into is, what type of fish do you want to grow? And since we have quite a few people on the call today and a lot of different interests, we wanted to poll the group and see what type of fish that interests you most. So we have 5 options for you to select, and I'm going to bet that the largemouth bass will be the winner, but let's take a vote and see. All right. Looks like I was pretty close. The largemouth bass with a significant win over the rest of the group at 85%. And again, this is pretty accurate with what we see day in and day out with the lakes that we manage. So next, we're actually going to talk a little bit more about fish. But before we do, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, please use the questions feature on the right-hand side of the webinar. We'd be glad to answer any that you have. And we have a couple teed up, but just wanted to remind everybody that there is an option there to submit your questions today. So Vic, you want to talk a little bit more about some fish?
Thanks, Dustin, and good guess on the largemouth bass. So far today, we've talked extensively about the importance of people in fisheries management, identifying stakeholders and understanding values and how they inform goals, all that being the critical first step. But if you think back to our definition of fisheries management, it's the manipulation of aquatic organisms and habitat for human benefits. And we've discussed habitat in great detail and how it relates to creating your dream fishery. So that ultimately leaves us with the last part, and that's managing fish. Many folks consider fish management to be manipulating harvest and stocking fish, but there's other things that we do as fisheries managers to manipulate fish populations. So let's take a look. Stocking fish is probably the most obvious form of fisheries management. It's quite common, but stocking should have clearly defined objectives, and careful consideration should accompany any decision to stock. So that being said, it's really not a cure-all as a fisheries management approach. There's a number of reasons why we stock fish. It could be that you have a new lake or a reclaimed lake. You need to introduce your initial populations. It could be to supplement a population that experiences poor reproductive success. There's a lot of species that are popular that won't spawn in a lake. Hybrid striped bass, tiger muskie, channel catfish oftentimes don't have successful spawning in lakes, so you need to supplement that population. Another reason to stock fish is to create a put and take fishery, and this is really popular with trout in the fall, winter, and spring, or channel catfish is a put and take fishery in the summer. It could be to introduce an alternative species or a unique and charismatic species like the tiger muskie that I talked about earlier. And with so many people interested in largemouth bass on the call, it could be that you want to introduce genetic diversity. And most largemouth bass anglers are well aware that genetics is a key component in largemouth bass management, particularly when you're talking about trying to grow fish that reach an ultimately larger size. So you want to introduce those Florida genes into the population. It could be that you have an abundant forage population and you want to control abundant shad or something like that. Mosquito control, you might want to stock fish that eat mosquito larvae and try to provide a break there, where they're legal. It could be to enhance or diversify a forage base. Again, if your quest is 10-pound largemouth bass or better, you're going to need to probably supplement that forage base with species that will help bass grow to that ultimate size. It could be you might want to stock fish to control an undesirable species. I guess two good examples would be tilapia to control algae where that's legal, and similarly, grass carp to control aquatic vegetation are two biological solutions for stocking fish. So there's just a number of reasons. So before you go into it, you really need to have a clear-cut idea of why you want to stock and sort of have that conversation with the fisheries manager to figure out what's best. When it comes time to stocking rates, generally that's going to be a little bit all over the place. Low stocking rates are going to help you achieve probably larger fish because you're keeping the population at a lower density. Higher stocking rates should give you a higher catch rate, but probably a trade-off in size of fish. We also are interested in novel stocking approaches, and one example that I'd like to share with you all would be stocking all female populations of largemouth bass, for instance. And as we'll talk about in a little bit, oftentimes largemouth bass, their reproduction is so good that they become overabundant and grow slowly. But if you stock all female populations, all of a sudden you've got some control on that reproductive success, and then ultimately female largemouth bass will grow faster than males beyond about age 4. So you're going to get that control on recruitment, and you're also going to get faster growth. Now, time of year to stock is an important consideration. Temperature is a big factor. So that's going to vary across the country. But the thing you need to consider is that, it's very weather dependent, temperature dependent, and because the warmer temperatures are going to stress fish out a lot more. Next, we'll talk about supplemental feeding. And if food is limiting for your bait fish, and I'm thinking about minnows and shiners and sunfish, then feeding a commercially made supplemental feed can enhance your fishery. It increases fish growth and production directly for the species consuming it, and then indirectly for the predators that consume them. It can also be used in turbid waters where fertilization may be ineffective at increasing productivity. So when used correctly, supplemental feeding gives bait fish sort of the needed edge to improve their survival and reproductive success, while also providing the pond with the needed food to support a greater biomass of forage fish. If you've ever seen a feeder, which is a picture of a feeder in the upper picture there, the fish response in a healthy situation to a feeder going off is really quite amazing. But you should consult with a fisheries biologist to assure that feeding is the right situation for you. It could increase the risk of low dissolved oxygen, increased nutrients. So it's better to find out what your goals are and how supplemental feeding works for you. And again, with those automatic fish feeders, they make feeding fish much easier, and they come in a variety of styles, often solar powered to make them simple to use. You can adjust the frequency of feeding, the duration of feeding events. But again, consult with a fisheries biologist to make sure that you have the right information to have a successful feeding program. Now, artificial feed, certain fish require specific feed in order to get all the nutrients to help them grow and live longer. Not all feeds created equal. Another attribute is there's low phosphorus feeds that help prevent excess nutrients from entering the water body and causing more issues down the road. If you can think back to when we talked about nutrients, and when you have excessive nutrients, all the risks that you run into, well, feed can contribute to that, but there are low phosphorus feeds available. Now, one of the interesting things about fish food is the conversion rate. And what the conversion rate is, it's simply that it's 2 to 1, which means that 2 pounds of artificial feed can grow 1 pound of fish. And as we'll see in the next slide, that's vastly different from fish that feed on natural diets like bugs and fish. Another added benefit to fish feeding is it congregates fish, and you can experience higher catch rates. The fish are staged around the feeder. They know when it's going off. It provides a great fishing hole for kids to enjoy. And again, bait productivity, whether it be your shiners, your minnows, or your sunfish, will improve with the additional food source. It could help reduce the need to stock more bait fish because you've got that 2-to-1 ratio benefiting you, adding poundage, adding biomass, productivity to the pond. These improved growth rates and survival rates and reproductive rates are all great benefits to supplementally feeding your fish. Why do you need a predator-prey management plan? And as we think about the conversion rate from artificial feed at 2-to-1, well, it's 10-to-1 for natural feed. So it takes about 10 pounds of prey fish to grow 1 pound of predator growth, have 1 pound of predator growth. So therefore, you need to have an ample and diverse prey population to maintain healthy predator fish. And if you think back several slides ago, I talked about that food pyramid, that triangle shape. It's widest at the base where you've got your phytoplankton, and it continues to go up. Well, oftentimes, in most unmanaged ponds, predator fish tend to overpopulate, dominate the prey fish, and while you may have abundant largemouth bass, they generally tend to suffer from slow growth and poor condition and aren't meeting your goals of a quality, healthy recreational fishery. So therefore, you need to have a predator-prey management plan and establish a solid forage base before introducing any predators. An example would be in a new lake. You'd ideally want to stock the forage fish the year before, say in the fall, and then the following spring introduce your largemouth bass so that they have your predator to prey ratio is off to a good start. The balance ratio will increase the productivity of your fishery and allow sport fish to grow faster and be healthier. And in a new pond situation, sometimes or oftentimes your best year classes of fish are those initial ones. So you want them to get off to a good start and take your time and have a patient approach and establish that forage base prior to introducing your largemouth bass. And a lot of times the way we develop these predator-prey management plans is electrofishing assessments. It helps us better understand the ratios that you have in terms of not only numbers of fish, but sizes of fish. Largemouth bass can consume a bluegill about a third of its length. So if you've got a bunch of 18 to 20 inch largemouth bass, but all your bluegill are 3 inches, that's probably not the best size for those larger fish. And not all fish species are suited to all ponds. Annual water temperatures will sort of help you determine which fish are suitable for your pond. And certain fish need the appropriate habitat in order to thrive. So often we take a twofold approach to bring balance to this predator-prey ratio. The first step would be to reduce the density of predators and then add the forage fish, because if you've got an out-of-balance ratio there, you don't want to add the forage and then try to remove the predators, because then you're sort of wasting bait on fish that you're eventually going to harvest. And there are a number of ways to remove predators, and it often depends on the species and type of water body you have. In a typical situation across the United States with largemouth bass population that you need to reduce, you can often come at it from a twofold approach with electrofishing and angling. Electrofishing is going to be more effective on the smaller fish, and angling, say 8 to 12 inches, maybe even up to 15, where angling might be less effective on fish less than 12 inches. But here's another way that you can stretch your dollar and provide value, and that is if you can keep up with the predator removal through angling and not rely on electrofishing. It's just another way that you can sort of be involved and hands-on with your management. So basically what I mentioned on the previous slides, a form of selective harvest, where we target certain sizes of certain species. So we're reducing the density of a population, allowing the fish that remain to grow properly and not compete with each other. Like I said earlier, overcrowded water bodies lead to poor growth, poor condition. And when I say condition, I mean a fish that is 16 inches and should weigh 2 pounds. It might weigh 1.25 pounds because there's too many of them. So we're reducing that competition, allowing fish to grow at the rate that they should to meet your goals. So those overcrowded situations are oftentimes just high density, small fish in poor condition. Now, selective harvest, if you can think about, most people are familiar with regulations, fisheries regulations on public waters. And that's just an example of agencies promoting selective harvest. And what's happened with largemouth bass management over the past 40 years is most anglers practice catch and release fishing, thinking it's better to release every single fish that they catch. But this often has a detriment to the fishery. So while most public water bodies are managed with minimum length limits because they experience such higher fishing pressure than private waters, private lakes and ponds benefit most from a maximum length limit or slot limits. And that's, again, just forms of selective harvest based on the data that are collected to try to determine how many of what sizes of largemouth bass or whatever species they are targeting need to be removed. Now, I mentioned in the beginning that we employ an adaptive management approach to fisheries management, meaning we begin with stakeholder goals. We follow up with a study, usually through electrofishing, to collect the necessary data, see if goals are being met. We recommend and implement management strategies to try to meet those goals, and then follow up with another study to determine how successful we've been. But because you're working with wild populations that live in dynamic environments, we often have to tweak our approaches to better meet goals. That's what adaptive management is. Think of it as a loop of constantly, starting with your goals, study, management implementation, study again to try to figure out where you're at, and then tweaking them a little bit. That's the adaptive part of it. So electrofishing is a common sampling technique that facilitates the collection of fish populations, particularly in lakes. And this should be done, as frequently as your budget allows to stay on top of any changes in your lake. Many of you may not understand how electrofishing boat works. These two pictures in the slide that you see are pictures of our electrofishing boat. So what you have is a generator that produces AC power, and that AC power runs into an electrofishing control box where we convert that power to pulse DC, which is safer on the fish. It allows us to dial in the correct settings so that it's safer for the fish and most effective for the biologists. We have safety switches that keep things nice and safe for the crew in the boat. And as you drive in the shallow water, there's an electrical field. That power goes to the front of the boat, creates an electrical field in front of the boat. You drive slowly. The folks up on front will dip the stunned fish and hold them in a live well, and then we can work them up. We can measure them for length and weight. We can identify them to species. We sometimes age the fish if that's part of the management. And you can inspect fish for sores and parasites or make any other observations. And then you can release the fish without harm back into the water. And it's these assessments that help form a customized fisheries management plan, which help clients reach their dream goal. And again, think adaptive management here. And the frequency with which you assess your fishery is going to depend on your goals, the management strategies being employed, and then, of course, your budget.
Thanks, Vic. Stocking, supplemental feeding, predator to prey management, and harvesting, these are all the key components in managing the ideal fishery. And knowing how to identify what a good fish looks like, it might seem pretty straightforward, but we wanted to see how many of you can identify what the ideal fish looks like in our next poll. So take a look at the three fish that we have on the slide, and let's see if you can get them right. All right, so it looks like most of the group selected the correct answers. What we're looking for here is so A and B are really the type of fish that we're trying to grow. The fish that you see in picture A is a younger, healthy fish that someday will hopefully grow to be the fish in picture B. And those are certainly fun to catch. The fish that you see in picture C is actually too skinny for its length. If this fish was actually grown properly or a fisheries management plan had been in place, then this fish would have probably been much fatter and looked more like the fish in picture B. So thanks again for your responses. And next we're going to summarize what we've talked about today and kind of talk about what a fisheries management plan looks like, and then move into our Q&A session. So I'll pass it back on to Dick. So I'll take over for Vic here. So how can you really achieve what your dream fishery looks like? It's not by implementing just a few of these strategies, but really all of them. In order to achieve a healthy, productive fishery, you really need to develop a comprehensive fisheries management plan that helps you proactively manage the fishery and kind of do the things that we've already talked about. Focusing on
Thank
water
you,
quality. Yep, there he is.
Yep, thank you, Dustin. I had a little technical glitch there, but I'm back. Let's go to develop a fisheries management plan. Okay, so as we wrap up to allow some time for questions, what are the steps to a fisheries management plan? And again, think about the three components that we've talked about. Make sure to identify your people or the stakeholders. Manage and assess your habitat so you can better manage it. Do you have excess nuisance vegetation? Do you have the proper water quality and nutrients? These are the things you need to assess before any strategies are implemented. Collect fisheries data. Try to better understand abundance, species composition, size structure, reproductive success, growth, survival. All these are key parameters that shape what you see in your lake. Develop strategies that over 5 years that are based on the data collected and meet the goals and budget for that lake. And everyone has a different budget. Some people want turnkey management while others have the ability to work on things like fish cover themselves and save themselves money or be able to reallocate that money to other areas. So developing a plan is based on your goals, your budget, your time frame, and an adaptive approach is the best way to achieve your dream fishery. And that concludes our presentation. We really appreciate your time and interest in fisheries management. And with that, I will turn it back over to Dustin as we address some of your questions.
Thanks, Vic. And before we get into our Q&A session, we invite you to just check out the link that you see at the top of this slide. There's a ton of great information as it relates to fisheries management that you have access to, as well as a ton of other topics such as vegetation control, aeration, and really anything related to lake management. And honestly, I feel that our website is probably one of the best resources for information when it comes to lake management. And we hear this all the time from folks who regularly visit the site. On the landing page, there will also be a video that you can actually see some of these services that we've talked about today in action. So now it's time for my favorite part of the webinar, and that is the Q&A session. We've got some great questions that were submitted to us, so thank you all to those who submitted. And the first question we have is from Greg in Georgia. So thank you, Greg. from Georgia for your submission. And Vic, the question is, how can you create a balance between aesthetic looking water and growing fish so everyone is pleased?
Well, I really like that question. I kind of referred a little bit back to it earlier, but it's, many people equate growing a fishery with a lake that is very green, meaning lots of phytoplankton. So productivity means less water clarity. So fish production is significantly better in water with a visibility of 2 feet compared to 10 feet. So there's this relationship between aesthetic looking water and fish production. And I've been fortunate to work on some projects that examine this relationship. And it's not necessarily a linear trend. And that's good. Many people associate good aesthetics with being able to see at least 3 feet in the water. That's what research has shown. So if you're standing in the water, can you see your feet if you're up to your waist? And what research has shown is that you can still have a very productive fishery with a 3-foot visibility. So at that depth, you're actually satisfying the desires of both groups, those that want aesthetics and those that want fish production. Now, if you want to push that fishery hard and get that visibility at probably 2 feet and have higher fish production, then you're probably going to lose out on the aesthetics a little bit. But if you can stay around a 3-foot visibility, I think you can do both. You can meet aesthetics and growing fish.
All right. Thanks, Vic. And our next question is from Darren in Indiana. Thank you, Darren. His question is, should aeration help address suspended clay issues in an established pond? So aeration is key to improving water quality and really reducing weed and algae growth over time. But in order to help suspend the clay particles that you're talking about, you're really going to want to look into an aluminum sulfate treatment. That's going to be key to clearing up that pond. While aeration along with proactive maintenance are the 2 key things for water quality, not so much with helping with suspended clay particles. His next question is, are there any affordable off-grid options for aeration? There are options, solar options, but those are really only for ponds less than 1 acre. Unfortunately, with solar technology, it's just not there yet for it to be as efficient as a power supplied aeration system. The costs are anywhere from 2x to 3x of a standard aeration system. So unless there's absolutely no way to get electricity to the water body, we try to steer our clients away from solar and try to get power supplied when possible. Next question is from Stephen in Maryland. Vic, his question is, do I have to eliminate grass carp to have a fishery?
Well, that's an interesting question, Stephen. I guess the quick answer is it depends. Carp can be part of your fishery. Carp are one of the most highly sought after species in Europe where they're native, but they don't have that same reputation in the United States. But they can provide recreational benefits, angling, and also they're highly sought after by bow fishers. The problem with carp in lakes is generally twofold. One is many anglers don't want a lot of their biomass tied up in carp, which generally aren't desired. So if you've got a lot of pounds of carp swimming around in your lake, that's less pounds of the fish that you're actually desiring. Second, when carp can become overabundant, causing the lake to stay turbid, which isn't aesthetically pleasing at all, and they also root up the vegetation, which we identified earlier as a good thing. So again, based on your goals and your population survey, you can develop a fisheries management plan that can deal with carp. Maybe they have to be reduced, but not necessarily eliminated.
Next question, Sean from Texas. And Sean asked, what are some algae control strategies other than using algicides? Great question, Sean. We get this quite a bit, not only about algicides, but herbicide use. And first and foremost, aeration is going to be key to help control algae growth. Next to aeration, and a cost-effective way to help reduce algae growth is beneficial plantings. If you plant beneficial vegetation around the water body, what you do is reduce the amount of nutrient runoff that you get into the water body, therefore reducing the amount of algae and vegetation growth. Next in line is tilapia stocking or illegal. Pretty common and also cost-effective way to help control algae growth. And the last on the list, and my least favorite, is pond dye or lake dye. I prefer the look of a natural water body as opposed to the pond dye, but this is also a cost-effective way to help reduce the amount of sunlight penetration in the pond or the lake, which in turn will help to reduce growth. So great question, Sean. Vic, next question is from Alex, also in Texas. How can you maintain existing populations of trophy bass on a small budget?
Well, Alex, that's a great question, and I'm sure that a lot of other people have that same thought. Like I mentioned earlier, people's budgets vary, and we constantly seek ways to stretch your dollar and provide value. So if your goal is trophy bass, then you have to figure out a way to develop a fisheries management plan that fits within your budget. So data collection is going to be important, so we know what we're working with. So the water quality test, the electrofishing survey, probably not where you want to trim cost savings. But can you fertilize? If the fisheries management plan calls for fertilization or adding cover, is that something that you or your fishing club or your neighbors or whoever can do that on your own? It comes down to sweat equity. That's a good way to keep the budget small. And like I mentioned earlier, selective harvest is one of the most critical strategies in trophy bass management. So rather than have an electrofishing boat come in several times a year to harvest bass, is there a way that the anglers who fish that lake can meet the quota as set by the fisheries biologist and say, if we need to take out 500 bass under 15 inches this year, can you all do that on your own? That's a terrific way to stretch your dollar and meet the goal of trophy bass on a small budget.
Next question, Grady from Texas asks, how can you balance a fisheries management plan with recreational use such as swimming, boating, etc.? Great question, Grady, and we get this all the time. Very common question, and this is related back to the case study earlier in the webinar from Lake Monticello. And what the lake needs to understand is that there needs to be a certain amount of vegetation for the fish population. And what we have seen is that a lot of times the lake is divided up, where half the people want a clear lake with no vegetation at all, and the other half want to grow large fish and catch a lot of fish when we're out there. Well, it's impossible to do both on a big scale. So you have to have some kind of a balance there. And again, that's all tied back to your budget, all tied back to the expectations of yourself or the community. But Vic, if you want to expand a little bit more, a little more detail, please do so. But Grady, great question, and thanks for your submission.
Yeah, Dustin's right. It's a common thing that we face, and it ties into stakeholder values. What we started the webinar with. The people that want to tube and swim, may not want the type of habitat and the type of water clarity that the anglers want. So it goes back not only to that initial case study, but the first question that we had in the Q&A session is, how do you balance that? And I think part of it is getting all the stakeholders on the same page so that the anglers can understand the values of the non-angling public, and also the non-angling users can understand what the fishermen want. So getting those on the same page, and then maybe shooting for that 3-foot visibility is a good way to sort of balance, like Dustin was talking about, the values of both groups. Good question.
So Vic,
a real challenge.
Can you still grow a 10-pound bass with water clarity of almost feet down to the bottom? Is that possible?
At what depth? At 3 feet, yes, you can. Absolutely.
Next question from Alan in Virginia. Thank you, Alan. Vic, his question is, what is the proper technique for stocking sport fish?
Wow. There are a lot of considerations when you're talking about stocking sport fish. What species are present in the lake that you're thinking about stocking? For instance, if you need to add bluegill, but you have a stunted largemouth bass population, so all your largemouth bass are 12 to 15 inches, you need to stock larger bluegill so they don't all get eaten. This kind of goes back to the gape size that I mentioned earlier, and you need to consider stocking rates and sizes and lake fertility. So if you have a new pond, you might want to take a patient approach and stock 2-inch largemouth bass at, say, 100 fish per acre. But if the stakeholders want to fish sooner, then you're going to reduce the rate at which you stock, not 100 fish per acre. You might stock at 15 to 25 fish per acre, but you stock catchable size fish. So some of the things that you're considering when stocking is rate and size. And as size goes down, rate goes up because you've got higher mortality of the fish that you introduce. Now, if you want trophy largemouth bass, then as I mentioned earlier, you're probably going to want to stock at a lower rate, but put the stocking into forage at a higher rate so that you've got that predator-prey balance that's conducive to the trophy fish. Time of year is another consideration. Again, talk about forage in the fall, largemouth bass the following spring. It's the best approach. Sometimes the timing doesn't work out for people, but the other way time of year works out is that temperature is going to be affected by that. Survival of stocked fish is going to be much lower in warmer water. So you're talking about windows of the year now. So maybe you're in Virginia, Alan. Maybe March, April, May, October, November would be good stocking months. All of a sudden, you've taken the year and you've reduced it your time allowed stocking. So, like I said during the presentation, stocking considerations should best be made after consultation with a biologist, and this can help alleviate problems down the road and save money also.
All right. Next question, and this is a good one, Vic. I think you'll like this one. From Jeff M. His question is, what is the contents of a fisheries management plan, advice on how he can come up with a plan, but more importantly, once the plan is in place, how data-driven is managing to that plan?
I think I know why you said I'd like that. So give me the first part of that question again, the context. Is that
the content? So what are the key things involved in a fisheries management plan? Just the bullet points.
Okay. So it's going to begin with identifying what it is you want out of your fishery, following up with some sampling, probably electrofishing to see what you have. Okay, so you're starting with data already. This is a very data-driven field. Fishery science is definitely all revolves around the quality of the data that you can collect. So you've got some data. It goes back to the adaptive management. Is your fishery meeting goals? And then you recommend strategies. So it's all going to depend on those data are going to dictate what strategies are needed to meet your goals. And then, so the bullet points would be all of the different things that we discussed today, whether it be habitat, whether it be, some form of habitat, whether it be liming, fertilizing, cover installation, things like that. And then what sorts of fisheries, and that's how we develop our fisheries management plans. We sort of break them up into two groups, habitat related and then fish related. So what sort of fisheries things can we do to meet your goals? And is that going to be harvest? Is it going to be feed? Is it going to be stock? What are the different things? And then again, if you're thinking about adaptive management, it follows up with another study, collect more data, try to figure out where you're meeting the goals and where things need to be tweaked. So it's very data driven, and I think we take pride in applying the best science possible and the newest science possible to what we're doing.
All right. Well, thanks again, Jeff M., for that question. Great question. And with that will conclude our presentation today. thank you everyone again for attending this afternoon, and definitely be on the lookout for the follow-up email with a link to the recording. We hope you learned a thing or two today, and if you had a question that we didn't get to, don't worry. Somebody will be in contact with you soon to answer your questions and discuss any other questions that you may have. Also, we have a short survey that we really appreciate your feedback in regards to the webinar today. If you have a second, please take some time and fill that out, and we will select one lucky survey participant for a $50 Amazon gift card and a Solitude cooler that will be sent to them. So thank you again, everybody, for attending. We hope you enjoyed it, and have a great afternoon.